Heavenly Father, as was said, this is our last class. But for every ending, Father, there's a new beginning. And as we attend this last class, we also expectantly wait to see what you have for us in the coming weeks and months with a new beginning. We thank Jeffrey for all his many insights, all his wise teaching. And we just ask you to be with him throughout the year and be with us as we listen for what you have ready for us to do. We thank you for all your many blessings on us, and we ask this in your son Jesus' name. Amen. Dr. Jeffrey, it's all yours.
Thank you. Well, thank you, and good to be here this evening, and good to see those of you joining us online, and very much looking forward to our session. Now we have about 3 sessions worth of material, which we'll try to condense into our session this evening. Now, having said that, we can't possibly cover all of this as I would like to. We knew that we were going to be hard pressed for time in this course. But those of you in the class and those of you online, please don't hesitate. Any comments, any questions you have. And by the way, those of you who join us online, all you have to do is hold down the space bar on your computer, and then you can comment or ask questions. So please don't hesitate to do so. Well, we said at the outset of this course way back in January that we had better take it seriously and get very prepared for what's coming this year. Of course, you never know all that's going to erupt, but so far it's been every bit as contentious and chaotic and eventful as I think we could have ever imagined. And you look at what's going on today on the college campuses, from Columbia, New York City, to USC out in Southern California and everywhere in between. And oh my, this country is out of control, to say the least. We need drastically a change in leadership in this country, to say the least. But there's going to be, I'm sure, far more drama and trauma this year before the election finally comes around. So let's be well prepared and well prayed up, because I think all of us take all of this seriously, as we should. And so it can be very, very disturbing when you see the trends. But we're supposed to be a source of light and salt in our society, and we need to take that very, very seriously and do all that we can to bring not only a measure of sanity, that would be a good start, but also, the truth of the gospel to all that we're experiencing. So we've covered an awful lot of material in this course so far, and we started out by talking about our current cultural crisis, and subtitled that "Living in a Post-Christian Society and Culture." And that certainly is the case. Most all of the Christian influences of the past have eroded or disintegrated, and that is more and more obvious from week to week, to say the least. We talked about the Bible and political theory. The Bible is the greatest book ever written on philosophy, and obviously theology as well. But also there are certain political ramifications that we can extract from Scripture as well. And so we talked about that, the American system, the foundational principles. Then we began our look at 3 books. One was C.S. Lewis on politics, government, and the good society. I hope you found that insightful. A lot of people, even those who have read a lot of C.S. Lewis's writings, don't realize how much he commented on social, cultural issues. Then we also looked at certain portions of the book, The Life and Legacy of Francis Schaeffer. and his views on Christian involvement in our society and in politics and so on. And then for the last several weeks, obviously, we've been talking about the Benedict option. Someone asked me a week or two ago what if I could name the 10 books in my life that have been most challenging or most influential, and I couldn't name them, just right off. But I very well could include the Benedict option as one of the 10 books I think that have been the most valuable and important to me. Obviously, C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity and others as well. But this very important book, we started out our study of the Benedict option looking at the article I'd written several years ago called The Benedict Option, A Necessary Preface. And since then, we've gone into systematically many of the chapters in this book, and we'll try to go as far as we can this evening. Now, a couple of points, though, that I wanted to allude to, and many of you are familiar with what do you call him, a comedian or something like that, Bill Maher. We never watch him, but anyway, he was interviewing a columnist for the Financial Times a couple of weeks ago, apparently very, very liberal person. And she said, the thing that's crazy is at a time when America is facing so many huge, legitimate threats, when there's such a tech revolution going on, when the economy is faced with all kinds of challenges, the idea that you're going to be fighting an election around this issue, referring to abortion. In other words, who cares? It's a minor issue. She says the very idea that you're going to be fighting an election around this issue seems to be, just very strange, like we're back in the 19th century. And many of you are familiar with Bill Maher's response, where he said, well, it's not strange if you're a believer that abortion is murder. That's why I don't understand the 15-week thing. Or Trump's plan is, quote, let's leave it to the states. You mean so killing babies is okay if certain state legislatures vote accordingly? And then Maher goes on to say, I can respect the absolutist position. He says, I really can. I scold the left when they say, oh, you know what, they just hate women. People who aren't pro-choice just hate women. He says, they don't hate women. The left just makes that up. They think it's murder. In other words, conservatives in general think that abortion is murder, and it kind of is. I'm just okay with that. It kind of is murder, but that's okay. It doesn't bother me that much. I mean, look, there's 8 billion people in the world already. I'm sorry, we just don't need any more. We won't miss you if you're aborted. Okay. So again, I think probably all of us have encountered that article and that quote from Bill Maher, but oh my, how insightful into the mentality and the moral sensibilities of people like that. Now, in response, an editorialist for the Washington Post put it this way, and she's an avid liberal leftist, and she's also very pro-abortion, of course. And she writes, quote, actually, abortion is a gift. And this is an odd way of putting it, but it's a gift that keeps on giving politically for the Democrats. It's an odd way to say it because obviously removing abortion rights from American women has affected many women's lives and has caused a lot of damage. Did you get that? Removing abortion rights from American women has affected many women's lives and has caused a lot of damage. It certainly causes a lot of damage to the fetus, doesn't it? Fetus, that's Latin. What would be the English equivalent of fetus? Yeah, baby, little one or baby, okay? But you remember that going back 20 or 30 years ago, the pro-abortionists didn't want to call it a baby, they called it a fetus, which actually in Latin means a baby, okay? So removing abortion rights from American women has affected many women's lives and has caused a lot of damage. Politically, for Democrats, though, it is their wildest dream. So in other words, abortion is the gift that keeps on giving to the Democratic Party because according to the polls, there's a lot of support for it, of course, in America. And it's thought that that benefits the Democrats. One last thing real quickly, and this comes from the reputable source, the Babylon Bee, false news that you can trust. And this article is entitled, quote, baby about to be aborted claims squatters' rights. And it says, in a brilliant last-minute move to avoid being painfully murdered by abortion doctors, a local baby just claimed squatters' rights indefinitely. So you can't remove me. Sources say the late-term abortion procedure was halted at the last minute as the baby confirmed via sign language over ultrasound that he had the legal right to remain in his mother's womb under Oregon law. This comes from supposedly Portland, Oregon. There's nothing we can do. It's the law, said the beady-eyed abortionist throwing up his hands. We can't dismember and crush this child until the legal system has done its work. Too bad. And goes on to talk about how this apparently very, very wise fetus taking advantage of the state's extremely liberal squatters' rights laws. And it ends with, at publishing time, thousands more babies were allowed to be born after they also claimed amnesty as undocumented migrants while emerging from the birth canal. So sometimes humor is, when things get so absurd, sometimes humor is very effective in making, valid points. So that's what we have to deal with. The America that some of us at least grew up in decades ago is long gone. And so we need to realize that, and how can we deal effectively with the situation as it is, and again, be as much of a positive influence for the gospel and for biblical truth as possible. Now, one more thing I wanted to start with, and this is only about a minute long, and Andrea is going to cue this up and play it for us. And this is about a 45-second outtake from a Woody Allen movie back in the 70s called Annie Hall. Probably a lot of you have seen that movie. And in this, it's a flashback to when he was an elementary age child and was struggling in school. And so his mother took him to see a psychiatrist, and listen to how the dialogue goes and to the, quote, wisdom that the psychiatrist has to offer.
He's been depressed. All of a sudden, he can't do anything.
Why are you depressed, Harvey?
Tell Dr. Flicker. It's something he read.
Something you read, huh?
The universe is expanding.
The universe is expanding.
Well, the universe is everything, and if it's expanding, someday it will break apart, and that will be the end of everything.
What is that your business? He stopped doing his homework.
What's the point?
What has the universe got to do with it? You're here in Brooklyn. Brooklyn is not expanding.
It won't be expanding for billions of years yet, Alvy. And we've got to try and enjoy ourselves while we're here, huh?
So that's the kind of wisdom you get, going to a professional counselor. And that is, yeah, the universe is going to explode eventually, but we probably won't be alive. And so our calling basically in life is to have as much fun as possible. Okay. Well, that's pretty disingenuous to use even on little children, let alone adults. But that's the kind of worldly wisdom that Scripture warns us about repeatedly. So that's, again, just another example of what we have to deal with in our modern times. And that is, life may not have any ultimate meaning and purpose, but we need to enjoy ourselves as much as possible, okay? Because it's not going to last forever, not in this realm of reality, at least. All right, so hopefully if you have a loved one that's needed counseling, or a grandchild or child that's needed counseling, you wouldn't take them to that particular psychologist or psychiatrist, although he's probably more the norm than the exception. Okay, well, let's go back to chapter 5 in the Benedict option. So if you're following along there, Dolly, by the way, has some extra copies of the outline notes if anybody needs one. And so this is a chapter that we haven't been able to comment on to any extent. I'll try to go through it and just hit some of the high points and then move on. But again, any comments or questions that you have, don't hesitate to ask. We can't cover all this material this evening as it is. So basically the thesis of this particular chapter, the chapter is called A Church for All Seasons. And Rod Dreher writes that a church that looks and talks and sounds just like the world has no reason to exist. Well put. We're supposed to be countercultural in the true sense of the word. And he talks about rediscovering the past. He says that contemporary Christianity suffers from what C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery. In other words, we think that we're the smartest generation that's ever come along, and that there's a limited amount that we can learn from the past. Many Christians and Christian leaders have little interest in or respect for church history and church tradition. But he says, basically Christian history in particular is extremely valuable and important. He says a big part of the falling away today, of the fact that churches have become, so many churches have lost any real impact on their society and culture. He says a major issue in that, a big part of it, is that our children don't know the history of Christianity or grasp why it even matters. Now, we have a course on Sunday mornings, history of Christianity. And we started back in 2012, I believe it was, and we went through a history of Christianity from Jesus through the Reformation. That took about 6 years to go through that. And since then, we've been in a history of Christianity in America. And so how many years has that been? It's been about 6 years. And we just now have broken through into the 20th century. So when we started all those years ago, I asked the class, now, do we want to just hop, skip, and jump through this material and just kind of superficially cover it? Or would you like to settle in and go into a lot of these issues in some depth? And they overwhelmingly wanted to do it in depth. So as Eric Smith once commented, it seems like we're studying Christian history in real time. Okay. So We presumably will finish sometime before the end of this decade. I would hope. But anyway, we can learn so much from Christian history, because when you study Christian history in a systematic way, you encounter basically every major issue and event and every major figure in Christian history very, very systematically. And it just opens up a tremendous amount of insight. But anyway, Rod writes in the book, again, a major, a big contributing factor to the falling away is that children don't know history, the history of Christianity, the history of the Bible. Well, many adults don't either. And for many, all they know is the Bible as interpreted through their pastor. I mean, there are churches here in Metro Atlanta, including very evangelical churches that generally are considered quite respectable, in which they totally downplay Christian education. And in fact, there are churches that have tried to cancel all adult Christian education. And it's as if the only thing we need to know is the little bit we're going to get occasionally from a pastor's sermon. And that's just so absolutely indefensible. And yet that is the mentality in too many evangelical churches. Many evangelicals don't even know about the Protestant Reformation, let alone going back, to the early church apostolic era. So rediscover the past. Rod really focuses on that. And then the next topic he takes up is recover liturgical worship. Wow, we don't hear that word in evangelical churches, Baptist churches, and so on, do we? Liturgical. Now, about 6 years ago or so, we were out in Southern California. I was doing some research at Reasons to Believe for a couple of weeks. And so I don't think Dolly had joined me yet out there. So on a Sunday, went to, I always try to go to churches that have some historical significance. And that would include for better or for worse, for that matter. But they are, quote, significant and influential churches, or at least were in the past or something. So I went to, along with my niece and her husband, we went to Saddleback Church, and many of you have heard of that. That's Rick Warren's church, and remember his Purpose-Driven Life book, one of the big books of the 2010s, I guess, and one of the real evangelical megachurches out there. Well, I remember sitting there at Saddleback and watching the, quote, worship service, and it seemed like a theatrical performance. And I remember thinking to myself, I'm afraid this is the future of, quote, worship in evangelical churches. It was, well, anyway, enough said as far as that goes. But the point here is that the form in which something is done and the form in which something is conveyed becomes itself the message. Remember Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message. And that came to mind as I was watching what was going on the stage as well there. And thinking, okay, is this going to become, the norm? And in fact, it is the norm in so many evangelical churches. Now, what Rod is arguing for in this part of chapter 5 is that Christian liturgy helps focus our heart and it stabilizes our thoughts and emotions. In other words, it's not all about being entertained and constant stimulation and so on. Liturgies, he says, should motivate and inspire us to commune with God. And communion with God, of course, requires periods of silence and prayer and meditation. And yet in so many, quote, worship services in evangelical churches, there's not 5 seconds of quiet. And he goes on to say that in the name of, quote, relevance, evangelicalism oftentimes incorporates so much pop culture fads and trends to the point of becoming irreverent. He quotes one pastor as saying, quote, "We detest entertainment as worship. We believe that God is to be worshiped in a way that communicates his transcendence." Say that again. We believe that God is to be worshiped in a way that communicates his transcendence. Contemporary worship, he says, is oftentimes very manipulative. God is not a fad, and God is not a hipster deity. Okay. Now, many of you are very familiar with the Jesus movement of the 1970s. We were very involved in that, and it had quite an impact on our lives and all. And sort of the epicenter of the Jesus movement was Calvary Chapel in Costa Mesa, basically Santa Ana, California. And we were out there at the height of it and all, and it was just incredibly inspiring and influential. And that's basically where a lot of contemporary praise and worship music began. Okay. Now, it wasn't like so much that you hear today under the guise of contemporary, which is kind of semi rock and roll pop music and that sort of thing. It wasn't that. But nonetheless, it was devoted almost exclusively to new music that was being written and performed there by a lot of the musicians and songwriters at Calvary Chapel. So I went back to Calvary Chapel 3 years later in 1975. We were first there in 1972. Went back 3 years later. Very interesting. This was on a Sunday morning. And I sat there, and when the worship service began, the pastor, Chuck Smith, came out on the stage and he greeted, the congregation. And then he sat behind, a platform, a podium or something, and the music began, and the lyrics were all up on the screen. But you know what? There weren't any performers on the stage distracting you from the lyrics. They were playing and they were singing, but they were down front, and you'd have to strain to see them down there, but you could hear them. And, they were very, very, very good, but there were no distractions. And I think by then, Chuck Smith had realized that worship is all about focusing our hearts and minds on God. And it's not about enjoying certain people on stage. And that can be extremely distracting, So that was very, very interesting to me. Now, Rod Dreher goes on to say in this chapter, too many of our churches function as secular entertainment centers with religious morals just slapped on top. He says too many churches have succumbed to modernity, rejecting the wisdom of the past ages, treating worship as a consumer activity, and allowing parishioners to function as unaccountable, atomized members. Christians often talk about, quote, reaching the culture without realizing that having no distinct Christian culture of their own, they have been co-opted by the secular culture that they wish to evangelize. So that takes us back again to, his thesis for this chapter, which is a church that looks and talks and sounds just like the world has no reason to exist. Again, any comments or questions, please don't hesitate. Okay. Chuck.
Yeah, the question I have has to do with the entertainment focus of our church services, and whether or not the therapeutic deism that sort of really covered the early 2000s is really in part the motivating force behind
Hmm.
I don't know if you have a thought on that.
Well, we live in a totally overstimulated society. Now here's an example, not that it's all that important. What's kind of the national pastime for spectators in sports? Well, it's really not, it's football, because in football, every play is like a 20-car collision, isn't it? Now, baseball is very slow, very plodding, sometimes extremely slow and plodding. And then there are moments of excitement and so on. But football, again, it's like a 22-car actually collision on every play. And basketball is also very fast-paced and so on. I love baseball. I also enjoy watching football to some extent, but baseball, frankly, is rather out of sync with contemporary lifestyles. And fewer and fewer and fewer young boys are playing baseball. They're opting for some other sport and all, and whatever you want to make of that is fine. But the point is, we do live in an overstimulated society and culture. And so the point here is that do we understand that, and do we just want more stimulation when we go to church, rather than the liturgical approach that Rod Dreher is advocating here, where you can actually go sit in silence, commune with God, yes, sing songs of praise and worship, but without it being an entertainment extravaganza. Okay. So yes, Paul.
So I'm not going to comment about church right now, but baseball. When was the last time you went to a Braves baseball?
Let's see, how old am I? Yeah, it's been 3 or 4. I think I know where you're going. What
happens in between the innings?
That's right. That's right.
You cannot have a conversation with it.
You're right.
It just totally takes over.
And even
I think that what you're talking about going on in our culture is that people have to have constant entertainment.
Yeah.
They can't be left to sit there and talk with each other about what just happened in the last inning or whatever.
You're absolutely right.
There's no pause.
And even if you go to a high school game or college game, they blast you with trash music at every opportunity. No, you're absolutely right. So the geniuses that run Major League Baseball, I mean, they're trying to keep up with times, but they, a lot of true fans find it very, very unnerving.
So going back to church, I see the word entertainment is being used, but another word that I think could be used for the way I feel at times is performance. Where I feel like the choir, the musicians or whatever, they're acting like they're in a Broadway musical, and rather than what I would, worship.
And there's nothing.
I don't really particularly care for the way that people go around the word worship and mean music. Oh, let's worship now. Let's go to worship. Well, the whole thing is worship.
Yeah.
It's not just when you're singing or when you're listening to the choir or something. The whole time is a time of worship.
Yeah, that certainly should be the case. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with Christian entertainment. There's nothing wrong at all with Christian concerts, but that's not necessarily a worship service, is it? Okay.
Jeffrey,
That's
2 comments. One on baseball I'd like to make.
Well,
I just wrote a letter to the hierarchy over at the Lawrenceville Stripers. They put in a new speaker.
That's the Braves AAA affiliate over there.
We get to see the same players just at different times. And I wrote a player. They put in a new speaker system. I can actually understand the words now than the old one, but it's so loud that my father, who was near death, turned off his earbuds and left them in because it was so loud. You could not have a conversation. And I think the stimulus gets to the point where the only only way you can get more. It's kind of like the alcoholic. He has to drink more to get more.
The same,
And
yeah,
he's
effect.
destroying his synapses on that.
Mhm,
The
mhm,
second point is that if you go back and look at church architecture,
mhm.
you'll see that the choir and the organ were in the back,
That's
in the
right.
mezzanine.
That's
If you
right.
go back to the 1700s and the 1800s.
That's right.
Because I went to one of the
Mhm.
oldest parishes in Massachusetts.
Mhm.
The organ was up above,
Yes.
and that's where the choir was.
Mhm,
They were never down below on the front.
mhm.
You know,
So you heard them,
right.
but
They were a
you,
choir of angels. That's exactly the phrase that you would hear.
okay.
And so you see how the structure of the church that we have now totally flips that.
Mhm,
Totally flips that because the choir was there to encourage the congregation to be the choir of angels.
mhm. Yeah.
And that's not what we have
Good
now.
point.
We have the exact opposite is that people don't sing at all because they can't hear themselves sing. There's no way to get pitch.
Mhm. Yeah.
So
Well, good point.
some of us, it may not matter, you're right.
Yeah, right. Some of us, we'd prefer not to hear singing. Yes. Yes.
First, a comment on baseball. I coach baseball up here at Upward. I've done it for several years now. And the waiting list of boys trying out for baseball is so great compared to football over here at Johnson Ferry. I'm coaching in the 5th to 7th grade area, and we have like 6 teams. And you could have had about 8 or 10 at the end of coaches, but
Mhm.
people just don't want to step up to help coach from that
Mhm.
standpoint. So if any of you guys want to coach, consider it. The other thing is, you ever read Francis Chan's book on the American church?
No, I have not read that.
Okay, he
Yeah.
basically says the same thing, that, churches nowadays, the worship service is good, but next week has to outdo the previous week. It has to be more entertaining. Many churches. But his idea is that he has gone to home churches. His philosophy is now to establish home churches under a qualified leader, deacon, whatever you want to call it,
Mhm.
and have smaller congregations meeting at homes to get more true Christianity, in his opinion.
Mhm.
How do
Okay.
you feel about home churches?
Well, we were actually involved in the house church movement starting in the mid-70s. And we were involved in the house church movement for 20 years. And yeah, I have a lot to relate to that and comment on that. It can be just a great blessing. It also has inherent issues and problems that have to be worked out. So it's pretty complex. It's pretty complicated. What we wanted to do back in those days, we were, of course, just young adults at the time, was to, as so many house churches have attempted to do, was kind of recreate in our minds the early church, and without all the institutional trappings. And our experience was in those 20 years, I oftentimes summarize it by saying it was the best of times and the worst of times. And I know that needs explanation. If you don't have time, we can talk about that after the class. But it is an option. It is an option.
I consider you somewhat limited in the ability to, feed the congregation, if you want to call it that, with the word. But I can see also where the distraction would be such they could focus more on Jesus rather than other.
Yeah, there are a lot of positives and then some obvious issues, problems. And one of the biggest was what do you do with the kids? And again, that's a huge topic that I don't have time to address. But overall, I'm not sure it was that beneficial for the children in the church. But let's talk more about that because that at the time it was referred to as the house church movement. In retrospect, it turned out to be more like a trickle than a movement. And it never became real common and popular. But there were definitely advantages to it, and then the other side as well. Now, Janet, I see here that this goes back quite a few minutes ago. You had made a comment, and would you mind just real briefly, what was the context for your comment? Do you remember? It's been a while.
Yeah, when you were just talking about looking at the protests that are happening on our college campuses right now, it's insane. It's actually what they're doing. It's terroristic threat charges, yet nobody's being arrested and charged for
Yeah,
criminal acts
yeah.
of
Well,
intimidation.
we have virtually no real leadership.
Right.
So that's a major contributing factor. All right, well, let's move on here in our study. And the next section here is relearn the traditional Christian habits of asceticism. Now, asceticism, of course, means self-denial, and that comes in many forms. It can be just, let's say once a month, for example, fasting one day, or it can be very extreme forms of asceticism. But in this section, Rod talks about the value of fasting and other forms of asceticism. He says, in a society that values comfort and well-being over everything else, and as we were just talking about, in a society that values comfort and well-being, but also stimulation over everything else, there may be no more essential Christian formative practice than regular fasting. So I think he's absolutely correct about that. He says that spiritual disciplines have nothing to do with legalism. They help control rather our impulses and our passions. And again, absolutely correct. He says everyday asceticism can include setting aside, for instance, time for solitude and silence, even if it's 15 or 20 minutes, daily scripture reading, prayer, meditation, reading spiritual literature. It can also include turning off the television, turning off the computer, electronic devices, and other kinds of distractions. So wise counsel, and we need to be very, very intentional about incorporating ascetic practices. Again, for some people, it will be, more extreme than others. But just breaking with your normal routine and setting aside that quality time to enrich your spiritual life. The next section deals with church discipline, and I won't go into that. He says one of the greatest challenges is in the area of sexual morality. Millie, I'm sure you get Warren Cole Smith's, what's he call it?
Ministry Watch.
Ministry Watch, yeah. And I tell you, every week, there's several stories that come up in Ministry Watch about sexual exploitation and all in churches and on the part of, church staff and that sort of thing. So I'm sure that comes as no great shock and surprise. The next section is evangelize with goodness and beauty. As our culture gets uglier and more chaotic, the truth of the gospel needs to shine brighter than ever. And he kind of digresses momentarily in this part of the chapter and talks about the limitations, as he calls it, of classical Christian apologetics. He says, we live in a postmodern culture in which most people are moral relativists. Well, that's for sure, even many who profess to be Christians. He says, therefore, most people don't respond on the basis of facts and logical arguments. Well, again, I'm sure that's true, but that's a major problem, isn't it? And he says this is, quote, the triumph of the therapeutic, the triumph of feelings over reason, as Philip Reef entitled his great book back in the 1970s, I believe it was. Now, Rod goes on to say that the first Christians gained converts not because their arguments were better than those of the pagans, but because people saw in these Christians and their communities something good and beautiful. This led them to the truth. Okay, well, there's truth in what he's saying there. And he brings up, as we read in the book of Acts, the expression, how they love one another. And that was the way Christians loved one another was so unusual in Greco-Roman society and culture. But anyway, I think there needs to be an addendum to what he's written here. And what he has written certainly is true, that the apostles in the early church basically introduced people to the gospel message, oftentimes through just love of one another, which was very countercultural, by the way, at the time. So that may be true, but the apostles, we have to realize, also testified to being eyewitnesses to the resurrection of Jesus Christ and the ascension of Jesus Christ. Those are apologetical arguments. And just as apologetics has its limitations, in other words, we can't argue anybody into becoming a Christian, can we? Likewise, though, we can't love other people into becoming Christians. It all has to be, born of the Spirit. They have to be led of the Holy Spirit. And so apologetics is very, very important, very valuable, because what it does is explain why the Christian faith is true, why it comports with reality. But of course, we need to share the gospel message in a spirit of love. Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict XVI, put it this way. He said, art and the saints are the greatest apologetic for our faith. Well, on the other hand, he was also an apologist, a Christian apologist as well. So we need both, frankly. We need to love others as we should, and we also need to be well informed so we can explain why it's reasonable and true to believe in the gospel message. Sixth, embrace exile and the possibility of martyrdom. And here we could cite numerous verses from Jesus, Paul, Luke, James, Peter, and others on the hostility of society in general toward those who truly follow the gospel message. So anything before we transition now into the next chapter, chapter 6, the idea of a Christian village? Anything? Yes, Dan?
Very quickly, I would gently push back, very politely and gently push back on the not arguing, because I would say that because the Spirit of God, God works in mysterious ways, and His work is unseen. So I think we would have some duty to use logical argumentation, and we will succeed in arguing them into the faith, if insofar as they follow the argument where it leads. And they'll only do that, I grant, if God so enables them. Is that a fair comment?
Oh, absolutely. Okay. Yeah. For people who are honest seekers of truth, right. Well, we can present why it's reasonable based on evident facts and evidence and logic, why the Christian faith makes sense. And are there any basic fundamental Christian teachings that are illogical or just outright fallacious or contradictory? No, not at all.
There's certainly a lot that's counterintuitive. I mean, you wouldn't guess at the Trinity if you were just walking in out of the shrubbery,
Well,
but there's nothing illogical inherently. We live in a world of 3 dimensions and so on. So.
Yeah, well, it's like I remember in.
Die for a good man, let alone somebody who's a sinner.
So, yeah.
There's that kind of thing.
I remember someone coming up years and years ago in a church, and they were struggling with their faith, and they mentioned that the hardest thing for them to conceptualize and believe was the virgin birth. And so, okay. So I asked her, well, do you believe in Genesis 1:1, that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth ex nihilo, out of nothing? And she said, oh yeah, sure. And I said, well, look, if you believe Genesis 1:1, there's nothing in the Bible beyond that you should have a problem with. I mean, if God has that kind of power, then a virgin birth, that's kind of a second class miracle compared to creating the universe out of nothing, all matter, time, space, so on.
Just to get a more Baptist feel to what he's saying there. He's all about community, parish, and his Orthodox certainly goes there. But if you go to chapter 2 of the book of Acts, it's his argument, Peter's argument from Joel 2. It wasn't because, gee, look at how they love each other.
Mm-hmm.
It was a proclamation of the gospel.
Well, and a fulfillment of prophecy.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I mean, it wasn't just how well you exhibit your love.
Oh, right. A couple of comments here. Let me see this. Oh, this is from Chuck. Okay.
Yeah,
he says, here is the book mentioned. And so if you'd like to make a note of that, Francis, is it Chan or Chin? Chan. Okay. All right. Okay. Let's go back then. All right.
One thing, Jeffrey, with the beauty, I think Ken Boa does a really good job emphasizing the beauty in creation. He's always bringing that to the forefront.
See, and that makes no sense that we think certain things are beautiful and ugly. All it is material stuff, isn't it? A rose, flower, and the Sahara Desert. I mean, it's all just material stuff. And so why should we think that something is relatively beautiful, something's relatively ugly? There's no naturalistic explanation, is there? It's just molecules. And yet everyone, believes accordingly. I mean, people on LSD trips will talk about how beautiful it was and everything. Well, again, where does that concept of beauty and ugliness come from? It doesn't make any sense if there's not a spiritual realm of reality. Yeah. Okay, well, chapter 6 is the idea of a Christian village, and he says the unofficial Clinton campaign slogan for 1992 was, "It's the economy, stupid." Let's see, what was the point of that anyway? I can't remember why I included that. It reminded me of, again, another Babylon Bee article recently. And the slogan that Biden unveils official campaign slogan. And after discussing various options, what they've come up with is, quote, "Death to America." So, you remember back in 1992, there was a three-way race back then, and you had Ross Perot running. And does anybody recall what his campaign theme song was? Ross Perot, his campaign theme song. Now, we assume anybody running for president must be, to some extent, have a mind to some extent, right? Nobody remembers? Well, it's a famous song from the late 50s, or early 60s by Patsy Cline. Does that give you a hint?
Crazy.
Crazy.
Oh, was it really?
Yes, it was. His campaign theme song was crazy.
I worked for Roses.
What's that?
I worked with Roses downstairs every day.
So you know all the lyrics to that.
He's known for being very cheap. He doesn't do well from what I've heard, but yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
That's what I heard. Never met the man.
All right. Well, in this chapter 6, Rod Dreher's point is that, you remember Hillary Clinton saying it takes a village, kind of borrowing from an old, supposedly borrowing from an old African proverb and all. Rod says, yes, it really does take a village. So despite the source there, Hillary Clinton, yes, it really does take a village to raise a child. He says, and here's something that he was corresponding with Michael Medved. Many of you probably remember him, well-known radio, conservative radio host. And in an email to Dreher from Michael Medved, Medved wrote, "You need to make sure that you live in a community that shares your faith and your values." Now, that's, of course, something that would have been, perhaps you could say, more feasible, in the 19th century and earlier than today. But Rod makes some very good points in this chapter. One, you see there in your notes, is turn your home into a domestic monastery. And he says a home, like a monastery, should be a place of hierarchical order, but one in which all members are valued and united in love. He says kids need to see that their parents are serious about their spiritual life. And a God-centered home with a regular schedule of Bible reading, prayer, stories, and discussions is really essential. He says there ought to be very strict limits on media. Quote, too much exposure to morally compromising material, which is pretty much all, normative when it comes to television, for instance. Too much exposure to morally compromising material will, over time, dull one's moral instincts. Says it's easy to become desensitized by constant exposure to violence and sex and obscenity and so on. I think all of that's rather obvious, isn't it? Don't be afraid, he says, to be a nonconformist. It's okay to be a nonconformist. Raise your kids to know that your family is different. Next, don't take your kids' friends for granted. He says parents should not outsource the moral and spiritual formation of their kids to their church or to a parachurch organization. Most church youth groups are about entertaining kids rather than educating and discipling kids. Don't idolize the family. He says good parents teach their children to think critically about the world around them, but without being paranoid and overly judgmental. So, of course, it has to be age appropriate, doesn't it? But, the older they get into their teenage years and so on, we need to, selectively expose them to the evil in the world, but in such a way that it doesn't affect them negatively. He says, make the church's social network real. Form strong social networks, both locally and nationally. Reach across church boundaries to build relationships. Now, here's an important point he makes, and I'm pretty much in agreement on this. He says old denominational rivalries, which occurred from the time of the Reformation, on. Old denominational rivalries are dissolving in the midst of our cultural crisis. Now, we all have heard stories about missionaries going off to foreign lands, and there might be several churches, denominational-based churches in a locale, but these missionaries are under a lot of pressure and face a lot of opposition. And we hear stories all the time about how these denominational barriers begin to break down because we need other Christians, whether or not they agree with us on every, issue. So a concept, remember, that Francis Schaeffer referred to as being a co-belligerent. We don't have to agree with somebody on everything to realize that we have a common enemy and, cooperate accordingly. He says conservative Christians, Bible-believing Christians, need to form a common front against militant anti-Christian secularism. That's pretty obvious. And also, we need to form a common front against liberal heresy and apostasy within many denominations and churches that pervert true Christianity. So the point here, and I think it's a very important point, is that conservative evangelicals, conservative Catholics, conservative Orthodox Christians and Anabaptists and so on have much more in common with one another than they have with liberals in their own church or in their own denomination. And I think we've seen that numerous examples of that, and Christians overlooking secondary issues that divide Christians denominationally, and realize that we need to work together as much as possible, because we live in a very, very hostile anti-Christian society and culture. Let's see, moving on here, move to chapter 7. And Scott did an excellent presentation on chapter 7 last week, so there's nothing much I'd like to repeat other than maybe a point or so. And one of the points, and I think Scott did emphasize this, and that is immerse the young in the history of Western civilization. And if you went to college in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and so on, you probably remember that Western Civ was probably a core requirement back in those days. Well, that's totally been removed, and in many of the supposedly elite universities, Ivy League, and so on, there is virtually no core curriculum left, and so you can get a college degree from outstanding universities like Columbia and Stanford and University of California and so on, without, and not know anything about Western civilization, American history, or anything like that. Also in this chapter, of course, he talks about, and Scott addressed this, start classical Christian schools. He says classical Christian education is the new counterculture. And he says classical Christian education emphasizes, quote, the great books of Western civilization, along with history, philosophy, logic, and rhetoric, and theology for the purpose of cultivating virtue and wisdom, and so on. And if you read that chapter, you know that Rod he can be pretty critical of Christian schools in general, because he feels like basically they train students pretty much like public schools do, except there's oftentimes a compulsory Bible class that students need to take and so on. But I think he's quite right about this. Classical Christian education, not just quote Christian education, is really what students need.
Lori Davis had a comment last week on that Hillsdale College has a great list of the classics. Janet, you might comment on that since you teach English, but if for people or grandparents who are buying books for their children.
Yeah.
Hillsdale had a
they just have great resources. I think this comment by Janet goes back a ways here, but my home is peaceful and full of God's presence. We've been with Janet even when she lived out in California, and we can testify that's very true of Janet's home. Says, I'm single, easy to do, but would like family. And, where do you get this sense of family? Well, that's what church is supposed to be all about, and forming, just very spiritually intimate relationships and so on. And it's what we would hope and pray for that all churches would be.
Just giving you a thumbs up, yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, thumbs up to you as well. In fact, we were out, Janet lived a little south of San Francisco, and we spent a couple of wonderful days with her about 10 years ago out there, and she was a wonderful host and all. We remember that very well. Now, Rod Dreher goes on to talk about the Benedict option in the university. He says student believers in universities today face more social pressure than any previous generation. Well, it wasn't exactly a real spiritually enriching environment when we were in college, but I'm sure it's considerably worse today. So I think that comment by his. Now, he ends this chapter with a warning. He says, if the much feared attempts to strip academic accreditation from Christian colleges and universities on anti-discrimination grounds, if those attempts materialize and succeed, there will be many fewer places for believing students to go and for faithful professors to teach. The Biden administration is trying to destroy Grand Canyon University, which I understand is, a very quality education, quality university out in Arizona. In fact, I believe it may be the largest Christian college in the United States. And the Biden administration is just subjecting it to unbelievable discrimination. Dreher goes on to say, Christian graduate students in the humanities tell me that they can read the handwriting on the wall in academia, and that they see no future for themselves as college professors. The total left-wing ideology of literary scholarship causes many Christian graduate students to forfeit their plans for an academic career. He says, the ground is moving very swiftly and decisively under our feet. It's time for Christians to recognize the danger and begin creating a Christian academic counterculture. And of course, excuse me, I saw those trends when I was teaching all those years at Georgia State, and I also taught 5 years at Kennesaw State. And a college faculty is sort of like a country club, or no, it'd be more like a cult. And that is typically, and especially in the social sciences, history, and so on, these people who pride themselves in being very tolerant and, quote, liberal, they're not at all. Now, they would be very tolerant toward people to the left on the political spectrum, but not to people necessarily on the right. He also makes an interesting comment in this chapter. He says, higher education in general is financially unsustainable and will collapse. Now, I was thinking today, watching television, what was going on at Columbia and NYU and University of Texas and USC out in California and so on. These are the very people that are clamoring for the cancellation of student debts. And they're just devastating, tearing up these universities, aren't they? And unfortunately, they have a lot of very influential forces that are supporting them, including the President of the United States right now. So being financially unsustainable and will collapse. John Mark Reynolds, who's a Christian apologist out at Biola University in Southern California, writes, quote, "College as we know it must die. The financial burden on students is just too great." We had one niece who went to Biola, which is a good school, but she graduated with a $120,000 student loan debt. Her major was photography.
So she made it up the first year.
Oh, I don't think so. No, I think that takes more than a generation. Rod Dreher says wealthy Christians need to redirect some of their political contributions and contributions to their churches, by the way, to classical Christian schools. All right, we move on here to chapter 8, and I'll.
Can I give a pitch really fast in the state of Georgia?
Yes, please.
To Christian schools.
Yeah.
There's
Allegra, a little louder for the.
Yeah, there's a program. I think each school has a different organization that helps them. But I know like Johnson Ferry Christian Academy, you can donate through a program called GASO, Georgia Scholarship Organization, something like that. You redirect taxes you're going to pay to the state anyway. There's a cap, you have to apply for it, but then school can use that money to help bring in students that might not be able to afford it. You can pick any Christian school, any private school, but I would assume we would all want Christian schools right here. But it's a great program, so if you're not familiar with it, it's something you should look into.
And I know we've done that.
It's a tax credit, so it's
Right.
actually dollar for dollar.
Right, so you
Yeah.
pay it, then you get refunded on your next tax return, but it would be taxes you're paying anyway, so it's really net zero as a taxpayer.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I don't know the name, the big program, like here at Johnson Ferry, the Christian Academy, they use a program called GASO, which is Georgia Scholarship Organization. Each school uses a different one, I think.
Whitfield uses, they call it GOAL, G-O-A-L.
Yes, familiar with that.
And last time I did a couple years ago, you had to apply pretty early in the year because it's so popular. You apply and then they tell you how much you got, how much you can give.
And it's only like 75% of what this year.
You may not be able to give everything you.
But if you have a particular school, you could just reach out to that administration and
They'll help
point
you do
to
it.
the one that they work with that helps them with their funding. It's a great program.
Good information. So if you have any questions about let me know and I'll forward it to Allegra. And all. But no, thank you for mentioning that. Okay, chapter 8, preparing for hard labor. The thesis of this chapter. Our culture is becoming more and more not just non-Christian, but explicitly anti-Christian. So Christians need to be prepared to rethink vocations in terms of the cost of discipleship. As you know, there's very troubling trends in a lot of professions, and in which a conscientious Christian is going to have a hard time, or it may even be impossible to pursue a career in that field. Now, when I was compiling my lecture notes on this chapter, I integrated something from a book that I read back in the 70s by E.F. Schumacher called Good Work. And in that book, Schumacher wrote, quote, "A person's work is undoubtedly one of the most decisive formative influences on his character and personality. The question of what the work does to the worker, though, is hardly ever asked. Let us then ask, how does work relate to the end and purpose of man's being? In other words, how does what we do for a living contribute to the purpose of humanity? He says, from this, we may derive the three purposes of human work as follows. First of all, to provide necessary and useful goods and services. Now, you notice he doesn't say just any good and service, but necessary and useful goods and services. Okay. Second, to enable every one of us to use and thereby perfect our gifts like good stewards, fulfill our, potential in life as much as possible. Thirdly, to do so in service to and in cooperation with others so as to liberate ourselves from our inborn egocentricity. So that comes from E.F. Schumacher's book, Good Work. And that's a book that I'd highly recommend to any student, preferably before they go off to college, but, nonetheless, good work. Now, the section Burning Incense to Caesar. Rod writes that due to anti-Christian bigotry and discrimination, there are areas of professional life that are becoming increasingly closed to Christians. He puts it this way: we may not yet be at the point, and by the way, he's writing, of course, 6 or 7 years ago. He says, we may not yet be at the point where Christians are forbidden to buy and sell in general without state approval, but we're on the brink of entire areas of commercial and professional life being off limits to believers whose consciences will not allow them to burn incense to the gods of our age. The workplace, he says, is getting tougher for Orthodox believers as America's commitment to religious liberty weakens. Progressives sneer at claims of anti-Christian discrimination or persecution. Don't believe them, though. While Christians may not be persecuted for their faith per se, they are already being targeted when they stand for what their faith entails, especially in matters of what's the most sensitive area out there that you better watch what you say. Sexuality, yeah. As the LGBTQ agenda advances, he says, broad interpretations of anti-discrimination laws are going to push traditional Christians increasingly out of the marketplace. And the corporate world will become increasingly hostile toward Christians. I think we probably have numerous examples of that going on. He goes on to say, by the way, that public school teachers, college professors, doctors, and lawyers will all face tremendous pressure to capitulate to this ideology as a condition of employment. So will psychologists, social workers, and all in the helping professions. And of course, he mentioned several other fields as well. According to the 2016 report of the Human Rights Campaign Foundation, which is an LGBTQ lobby group, and again, he's talking about a 2016, that's pretty out of date by now, isn't it? More than half of top US companies have a perfect score when it comes to promoting the gay agenda. And that's again, 7 years ago or more. Christians are being forced to attend diversity training workshops and pressured to publicly declare themselves allies of their LGBTQ colleagues. And remember, let's go back 7 years ago. The T was hardly ever mentioned, the trans.
Look at what happened on Friday, right? With Biden's changing your title.
Tell me, I think I heard something, but I don't know the details.
So he's inserted a lot of the transgenderism terminology into what is considered the protected class now on your title.
Yeah.
Everything but sports.
Albert Mueller did a great podcast on it last Friday. The Colson Center's talked about it. Allie Beth Stuckey interviewed lady at Alliance Defending Freedom recently, and Alliance Defending Freedom is really going to be standing in the gap.
Oh, it's a great organization.
Yeah, so just another example of just the snowball.
Well, and as we're making out, you know, our contributions on a monthly basis or whatever, I'd highly recommend that you consider the ADF, Alliance Defending Freedom. There's many great organizations out there worthy of our support, but I don't know of any that's better than the ADF. So Christians are being oh, by the way, the NAIA, which is smaller colleges, they've banned trans athletes.
It won't stand now because it's federally stated.
So that Biden,
No, that doesn't apply to sports.
it does not apply to sports.
He didn't do sports.
Well, I know the NCAA is debating
Well,
it
eventually,
now.
but I mean, he didn't
So-
address it now because he knows he would lose it in the election. People would be, it's very unpopular.
Okay,
60–70% of Americans don't think that you should have boys on girls' teams.
okay,
But so they didn't specifically address that.
okay.
They might expand it like they always do. But they didn't.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mhm.
they did put in stuff like you have to address kids by their preferred pronouns, and even to the point of parents might be losing their kids' custody
Mm-hmm.
if they don't call them by their
Mhm.
preferred pronoun,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of thing. And of course, all of the due process protections that if you were in a regular court of law, you would have if you're on a college campus and you're accused of a sexual advance on somebody, then those don't exist anymore. That was reversed by Betsy DeVos, but that it happened under Obama.
Yeah, that's
before.
right.
Obama administration had put
Remember
those,
that.
kind of taken away those protections from people who would mostly be guys, I would think.
But-
Yeah, you don't have that many females trying out for the football team.
No, this is not,
Yeah.
I'm talking about
So,
somebody accusing you of rape or.
oh, okay, so we're, not-
And you're being
okay.
tried on a campus court,
okay.
not.
No, but Jeffrey's
Yeah.
right. The smaller conference, I forget what's the acronyms,
NAIA,
They did pass that.
Yeah.
They did establish that they will not allow biological males who identify to be females to participate in women's sports.
Mhm.
And the NCAA is going to debate the subject.
Mhm.
And I hope they have common sense and prevent it.
Is that not illegal these days? Applying common sense to an issue?
It's called science.
Yes. Well, common sense and science, yes, you're quite
Yeah.
right.
In these Title IX revisions, they didn't define male and female or sex, or it's not in there, so that it's very vague,
Okay,
because that would pin them down.
okay. Yeah.
Given the change in the Supreme Court composition, there's a chance that challenge would be reversed, even though it may reverse part of an earlier Supreme Court decision.
If John Roberts
Yeah,
is on the right side. Uh-huh.
He's a
Yeah.
trans of a different nation.
Yeah.
Jeffrey,
Yes, Phil?
Attorney General of West Virginia signed into law. The Attorney General in West Virginia signed into law a law that bans boys, trans boys competing in girls' sports.
So in West Virginia, you say, okay, all right. I
But
assume, aren't there
what-
other states that have?
Can I put in my 2 cents? What we can do though is pray, because right now there's this group, and I'm putting it on the text, outkick.com,
Mhm.
being led by Riley Gaines and 3,000 other female athletes, collegiate and at every level.
Mhm.
Because we need to stop this nonsense. Title IX was to protect women, to give them equal rights with men,
Mhm.
and biological males who identify as females. They have science proves how many advantages they have over a woman's body. So it just needs to be stopped. So please pray for these like Riley Gaines and outkick.com,
Mhm.
and for some legislators and some leaders to do the right thing,
Yeah,
make the right decisions.
yeah, and you were a track athlete in college.
I was a basketball state champion,
played college ball, ran track and field. And so I feel very passionate about this subject.
Mhm. Well, it's not only all about common sense. It's just, you know, and science. It's just basic morality, isn't it? All right. Well, let's finish up real quickly here. Uh, Christians are being forced to attend diversity training workshops, pressured to publicly declare themselves allies of the LGBTQ agenda. He says it will be impossible in most places to get licenses to work without affirming sexual diversity dogma. I mean, corporate America, which, you know, there was this myth for decades, corporate America was, you know, generally conservative. No, not at all. And we see the impact today. So you see there in your notes, he calls on Christians to be prudent, and if possible, as we read in Romans 12:18, be at peace with all people, if possible. But when it comes to speaking the truth, tact is a virtue. We need to do it in a spirit of love as much as we can. Be bold, be entrepreneurial. He says, develop a service or product to meet the needs of people if you're just starting your work life and so on. Buy Christian, even if it costs more. Rediscover the trades. I know this is a bit of a trend, and that's great that it is. Christians should consider traditional trades like home improvement, electricians, plumbers, HVAC techs, and so on. So again, some very practical applications there in chapter 8. Well, chapter 9 and 10, obviously we're out of time here. So next week, and this goes for those of you joining us online as well, next week, we thought about, in fact, I think Donna recommended this, and that is we have a common dinner together here in the room at Johnson Ferry. And so we'd like to invite those of you who join us typically online as well, if you'd like to take one night to come and join us in a common dinner. And we'll make the time, you know, beneficial, and we'll talk about some of the points in the rest of the book, but primarily we just want to get to know one another better and interact and so on, but we also want to, you know, make it focused on our course this semester in the book as well. So that will be at 6:30. What is the room number for this room?
It says 377 in your notes.
Well, that's incorrect. What I wrote in the notes, that's incorrect. I think the room number.
Just tell them to read the updated email.
Okay.
320.
320.
It's a big room, 320 to 342. And so if at all possible, we'd love to have you all join us next week. Now we need to know, we'll send out an announcement and ask people to RSVP so we know how many tons of barbecue to order. And
Do you want to show of hands now?
If you get started, that would be great.
well, that would be a start. Okay.
I'll raise my hand to go. I'm sure I won't eat alone.
And
I'm raising my hand too.
I see you, Janet. So, okay, that gives us a little bit of an idea. And
Can we bring side dishes or desserts or something?
Donna, why don't you come up real quickly and just, because you've done most of the thinking about all of this.
Very much in the forming stages, so, but pie.
Drinks.
Yeah, drinks. So again, we really wanted to get an idea of what kind of a response we would get. And hopefully there'll be a lot of people online that we never get to see in person. And hopefully all of us here want to come. Our thought was maybe barbecue. That seems pretty universal. Perhaps to buy the main, the meats and buns and stuff like that. But it might be nice to have people bring desserts, drinks, maybe plates, cups, that kind of thing, because there may not be enough. But like Jeffrey said, we'll send out an email to get some RSVPs so we can get some concrete idea, and then people can volunteer and we can say, okay, so-and-so's bringing this and so-and-so's bringing this. We've got 5 pies, we don't need any more, we need this, so that we have a nice variety. So, and if everybody is okay, we just figured barbecue was easy, a couple of good places and not too expensive. Does that sound okay to anybody object?
But we don't want everybody bringing M&M.
Maybe a little bit, yeah. Okay.
So we'll get the word out as soon as possible, next day or two?
Yes,
Is that all right?
yeah, that would be
Okay.
great, so we can start solidifying everything.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So again, it's always wonderful to see you all who join us online. And if it's possible, join us next week in person. And we'll do a lot of socializing, but also deal with some of the issues in the book that we didn't have time to cover. So been great being with you all. Gosh, this is our 15th week, which almost sets a record for the length of a seminar. But great material, like the Benedict option and a lot of the other materials we've read and discussed. So thank you for being with us. Been great. And so let's see, let's close in a word of prayer. And Bill, would you mind coming up and leading us in prayer as we close things out?
Oh, Father God, thank you for this time of fellowship. Thank you for, we know the time that Jeffrey took to be able to facilitate everything tonight. And Lord, our country needs revival, Lord. We need a great awakening. Oh, Lord God, we need your help to set our compass back to north. Right now, it's on a trajectory of south. Please, dear Lord, be thy will, bring us back to the right trajectory, to bring us back into fellowship of believers. And Lord, help us to become more reverent, and help us to have patience with our friends that are lost, for there are so many lost. Dear Lord, lead us and guide us and direct us. And everything that we do and say, and let everything that we say and do be pleasing in your sight, Lord. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Can you imagine being a parent and you've just written out a check for $60,000 to send your child, your little girl, to NYU, and you're sitting in your easy chair and you're listening to the news, and all of a sudden you see your precious child on the TV waving a Palestinian flag, marching, and you're going, no, no, that's not Linda. No, can't be. But can you imagine? Do what?
Imagine being a Jewish parent.
Oh yeah, yeah. Oh goodness.
And seeing that
Whew.
their Jewish child is subjected